Thank you for joining today's webinar. You are in the lobby. The webinar will be starting soon.
Right. Alan, could you just mute your video for a minute, please?
Thank you for joining today's webinar. You are in the lobby. The webinar will be starting soon.
Good evening. My name is Andrew Dodd. I'm a member of the IET Buckinghamshire Committee, Local Network Committee. Sorry for the slight jump out of a slideshow there. A very warm welcome to you if you're joining tonight's webinar, Wow, It's Bright, which is going to be presented by Allan Howard from WSP. This event is being recorded, so the video will be available in about 2 to 3 weeks' time on the IET Buckinghamshire website. I find the easiest way to get to our website is just to Google IET Buckinghamshire, and then Mr. Google provides you exactly the link you need, and then you'll find their videos as one of the tabs, and you can go in and see the video, but it'll probably be 2 to 3 weeks' time. Hopefully there'll be a PDF available of the slides from tonight's show, and they will be uploaded as soon as they're available. Just before we start tonight's presentation, I'm just going to deal with some matters. The IET is currently undertaking a body of work to better understand the characteristics of the IET community's audience and how well they're being represented. At present, the IET does not have the data to understand where improvements are needed in order to address particular demographics. If you can, please will you take a short demographic survey which remains open throughout the whole of 2021. What I'm going to do is I'm going to post the URL to this survey in the chat line, and I'll do that shortly after the event starts. Looking ahead, IET Bucks, we're hoping to have a webinar on the 21st of October or thereabouts, which is on 5G technologies. Just for various reasons, this might be postponed. But we are hoping to run that at the end of October. And we will also have our Cisco annual lecture, where Cisco come along and every year talk about a particular topic. This year, we're going to look at the impact of 5G, and that will be held on either the 16th or 23rd of November. If you're interested in joining that one, please keep an eye on the events page. Further details will be posted soon. Now, I'm just going to do a shout out, slightly unusual. I, for various reasons, need to know a bit more about emergency shutoffs and with key release. And I have access to some various emergency stops which have a variety of keys to operate them, including one which is quite popular, the 455 key. If you are knowledgeable about emergency shutoffs and the 455 keys and similar types of keys, I'd very much like to hear from you. It's a bit of personal consultancy to me. I will put my email address, if you wouldn't mind just dropping me an email saying if you can help me. That'd be great. I just need to chew over somebody who's used to putting in, has either installed or is used to specifying emergency shutoffs with key release. Okay, that said, it's now time to start tonight's webinar, which is called Wow, That's Bright. It's going to be presented by Allan Howard from WSP Limited. Tonight's event is worth 2 CPD points. There is a CPD certificate. That's the real one for tonight. It will be posted, or has already been posted, on the IET Buckinghamshire webpage. It's there both attached to a blog and attached under files. I will post the URL to the blog in the chat line, and then you can call it up at your convenience. Again, if you don't get the URL, just Google the IET page, Buckinghamshire page. The other thing to say that please, if you've got any questions about Allan's presentation, please put them in the Q&A channel. That way, that's what we're going to be looking at. Don't put them in the chat line, please, because that then just sort of confuses you. It doesn't mean to say you can't put anything in the chat line, but any questions to Allan, please put them in the Q&A. You can vote for topics. So if you see a particular question to be asked, you think that would be fantastic, you want to ask something very similar, you can put a thumbs up, and that also helps me moderate at the end to know what questions to put to Allan. All of the questions will be saved up to the end of Allan's presentation, and then Allan will answer them. What we'll do is we're going to take all the questions at the end, ask Allan nicely if he wouldn't mind looking through all the questions. There are any unanswered, to give us some answers, if he doesn't mind. A bit of late homework. I'm sorry, Allan, to spring that one on you. But, you know, if the question's already been answered, that's fine. But, you know, sometimes we do get some questions left at the end. Okay, well, with no further ado, I'm going to hand over to you, Allan, for tonight's presentation.
All right. Thank you very much, Andrew. Good evening. My name is Allan Howard. My role is as Group Technical Director for Lighting in WSP UK. I've some 39 plus years experience in the field of light and lighting, and over the last part of that time I've more specialised in the impact of artificial lighting on the environment. And through that, I've contributed to several national and international standards and guidance documents that have been developed to help people understand the impact of artificial light on the environment, whether it's sky glow, fauna and flora, humans, and so forth, and how those aspects can be mitigated and lighting installations successfully designed and installed. So, as Andrea said, the title of tonight's presentation is Wow, That's Bright, and it's all about preventing obtrusive light. It's about where we need to go and put some lighting in, how can we do that and make sure it achieves the task without actually becoming a problem. So what I'll be doing is I will be considering artificial exterior lighting in the main. We'll look at the benefits of artificial light, the concerns, and when artificial light goes wrong. We'll then look at how we apply it responsibly. We'll pick up on a few case applications, and we'll look at some documents that are there to help designers, environmental officers, planners, and so forth understand what they need to consider, what's been proposed, and everything else. And then, as Andrew says, we'll finish off with some questions and answers at the end. So we're living in the 24/7 environment now. Artificial light has become part and parcel of daily life. It's needed there for a range of different purposes. And in general, what we're there is artificial light is there to provide safety. For a safer road network, it allows users to identify hazards within the roads. It enables pedestrians and cyclists to orientate themselves and detect vehicular and other hazards. It helps us provide a safe working environment. And also in the exterior realm, it plays quite a role in helping reduce the perception of crime and disorder, and depending who you want to listen to, actual crime and everything else. But really what it does do is it enables people to assess the movement and intent of others. From a benefit point of view, we can see that it can really enhance the local economy. Through good amenity lighting, we can create interest in a certain area, and that will draw people through, or we can create a sort of warmth of feeling in an area that helps improve the nighttime culture, especially over recent times where we've seen more of a move to eating outside and just being out at night in the environment and appreciating what's around, and we can create that interest and draw people in, and therefore that helps the local economy. And it also supports the participation in sports activities after hours of darkness within certain limits and so forth. There are obviously concerns around the use of artificial light. Of course, it uses energy and carbon, and as we move towards net zero and other aspects, we've got to look at how we can responsibly apply artificial light and make sure that what we do achieves the required task, but at the same time does it as energy efficiently as possible. But as part of that, what we don't want to do is we don't want to create light pollution. And we don't want to look at the creation of obtrusive light or light nuisance, and we'll come on to certain aspects of that later in the discussion. And also we've got to remember that it's not just humans out there, there's fauna and flora out there, and artificial light will have an effect on insects, will have an effect on bats, and also on plant life and so forth. There's various aspects that we look to. The main aim of a lighting installation shown by this diagram courtesy of the ILP is that we're there to light a task. So we want to make sure that we effectively light the area that needs to be lit to the right level. There may be some backlight from the lighting installation, but also what we're trying to do is we're trying to minimize the spill light towards properties. And that light can either be the light that spills on the area, or it can be the intensity of the light source itself. And we'll pick up on these things as the conversation goes forward. And we also want to manage the direct upward light, because that contributes tremendously to sky glow and affects us and stops us being able to see the beauty of the night sky and the stars, which we're now seeing through the creation of various dark skies parks and everything. And you can go there and you can actually really see the wonder of the night sky above you, etc. So when we're looking at anything to do with the application of artificial light, we need to establish the baseline. And that's done by looking at the environmental zone. And within planning and lighting, what we have is we have five zones, E0 through to E4. You can see the table there that gives the description. And they're from basically protected night skies as E0 through to the city centre, which is E4. And then we've got rural areas in between, and there's some examples there and descriptors that just help us determine how we can establish that. And within lighting circles, there's also approaches that we will do to go out there and carry out photometric performance measurements using an illuminance meter at head height 1.5 meters, measurements facing north, south, east and west, and one at ground level. And through the accumulation of those readings and what's called SQM measurements, which is a star count measurement, we can establish more accurately the environmental zone that we are in, and therefore look to the limitations that will be placed on us to make sure that the lighting installation does not become a source of obtrusive light. Now, within that table that we've just shown, there's various notes and, as you might expect, to go with these things. And what we're sort of saying is that where an area lies on the boundary between two zones, we would look to enforce the requirements of the most onerous zone. Light itself knows no boundaries. It will spill from one zone to another. So we look to use the requirements of the more onerous zone. If we've got areas that are under protected designations, then we look to a more rigorous requirement or etc. And one zone will always be surrounded by the next highest zone and so forth. You would not expect to find an E1 zone abutting an E3 zone, for example. There would be a transition zone in between. But this is where we really need to talk to the planners to establish what the zones are, agree through the processes that I mentioned just now, what we think the zone is. And once we've got that established, then we can move ahead to look at the lighting installation we want to put in there and how it needs to be controlled. Now, essentially, there are a number of main concerns. From a human point of view, spill light, and that's light that falls onto the horizontal and vertical surfaces, is of great concern. But there's also the intensity, and the intensity, as we can see from the bottom photo here, is really the brightness, to use a term, of the light source towards the observer. So if we look at these two pictures here, which are of the same football club, and they had their lighting put in. As you can see from the bottom picture, the pitch is beautifully lit, but the problem we've got is that we have this tremendous spill light onto the residential properties, as we can see on the top, clearly there by the shadows across the road, onto the windows, etc. And from the residents' point of view, that is the view outside from their kitchen of the sports lighting installation and from the bedrooms. And under the Clean Neighbourhoods and Environmental Act back in 2005, artificial light became a legal nuisance. And therefore, we've got parameters that we need to look to consider and apply. And these I'll touch on later as to where they come from. But if we look at spill light, the table there taken from CIE 150, which looks at obtrusive light, that gives us the limitation values that would apply in the certain circumstances. Now, this football club is in what we call an E4 zone, and therefore the maximum amount of light on the window is considered as being 25 lux pre-curfew. And when we were out there measuring that, we were measuring something like 45 lux, so there was clearly too much there. And also, we then have also a limitation for intensity factors as well from another thing. But a lot of values are given post and pre-curfew. And for the likes of this sort of sports installation, the curfew thing was required that the main pitch lighting would be turned off at 9 o'clock anyway. And also then the associated lighting with the club would be turned off within an hour of that time as well. But during the pre-curfew time, there was too much light and they had to go and look to resolve it. And the answer is not thick curtains. The answer was they had to go and readjust the lighting. They had to go and change some floodlights. They had to put in certain cowling. So they kept the pitch lit. And then when they did this, there was virtually no light outside the area onto the road and onto the property. Another aspect we're looking at a spill light is that if we want to go and put in a new installation and it's adjacent to another area, then we've got to make sure that the spill light from an installation that's going in does not adversely affect the use of the area it's adjacent to. So that could be a road. We don't want a lot of light spilling onto the road because it will affect the lighting performance of the lit road. And if the road is unlit, then that is also potentially quite an adverse issue. So it may be that we need to look at tighter controls. Now, this little diagram we got down the bottom, we had a sort of a building going in towards the top, but the amount of spill light into the bottom half, which was a loading bay, was tremendous and would affect the health and safety within that area. So that lighting then had to be designed to keep all the spill light, or rather make sure there was no spill light outside the zone of the new construction, so that it didn't adversely affect the operations of the adjacent building. And the same would apply for a road. We don't want a lot of spill light onto the road because it can affect the uniformity and performance of the road lighting. And as I showed in one of the earlier photos of the sports club, we can look at how bright the light source was, and what we've got there is we have a measure of what we call luminaire intensity. And that is the amount of brightness in the field of view. And what we've got is we've got guidance on how we will look to limits of luminous intensity for bright luminaires. And that in itself is a factor of the distance of the observer from the luminaire and the actual area of the luminaire that is visible towards the observer. And there are calculations that we can do with that, because essentially intensity is the illuminance, it's the lux level at the observer times the square of the distance. But there is software that can do the calculation for us. But what we understand is that views of bright surfaces of luminaires can be a nuisance to occupiers of premises. And the assessment is always taken from positions where such views are likely to be maintained. So it's not necessarily a fleeting view because someone's walking along an area, it's where a view will be maintained. So we're not looking at short-term views. But as we can see from the picture down below of the railway station, that's the same luminaire along the station. But as you can see from an observer's point of view, the same luminaire presents a different bright area of luminaire, the lit area towards the observer as you look down the platform. And it's that sort of thing that we look to assess. And this is where, unfortunately, it gets very complex, and I'm not going to go into the full details. But basically what we have down the left-hand side here is we have the determination of the environmental zones I mentioned before, E0 to E4. And then we have a measure here of the apparent area of the luminaire. So that's the bright area of the luminaire that the observer can see. And then we've just got a calculation area. So in an E0, a dark landscape, a dark skies park, it's not allowed. But in other areas, we've just got this calculation, let's say for here, in a E2 zone where we've got a luminaire of an apparent area of 0.02 to 0.002 to 0.01. The limiting factor is 1.3 times the distance, and that will give us a value that we would then use to assess whether the intensity is going to be too much or too less. But also in the old guidance, the method of this was per luminaire, and that's not really right, because if we again go back to this football club, you know, we can see on the left hand side that we have a mast there which has got 16 floodlights on. And the limiting factor used to be that it was per luminaire. And so each one could be very close to the limit, but therefore it was acceptable. But from an observer's point of view, if we look at the picture in the middle, that is one light source. So what we've done in the UK now under guidance note GN01 from the Institution of Lighting Professionals is we said that that is now treated as a single luminaire, a single light source, and the limiting factor applies to that, because that is what makes sense to the person in that house opposite. And we can't say that each of those 16 is just within limit and therefore it's okay, because the contributing factor is far too high. Now we've got intensity, which is the brightness of the luminaire towards the observer, but there's other areas we just need to consider, and there's other terms just it's worth mentioning. And one of those is glare. Now glare is a condition of vision in which there is discomfort or a reduction in the ability to see details or objects. And this is generally caused by an unsuitable distribution or range of luminance or by extreme contrasts. And within that, we've got the two types of glare. We've got discomfort glare. Now that's glare that causes discomfort without necessarily impairing the vision of objects. And then we've got disability glare, and that's glare that impairs on the vision of objects without necessarily causing discomfort. And we've got a number of pictures down there. The picture on the right-hand side in the middle is a facade that's been lit in the city of Westminster. Quite poorly done. We can see from the middle picture that actually these are residential premises and these floodlights shine straight into their windows. But from a driver's point of view of coming down there, we've actually got a source of disability glare, because that is quite bright and it is actually distracting the drivers from seeing the road task ahead, and therefore needs to be resolved and looked at. Another terminology that we generally use is brightness, and brightness is not really something that's necessarily measured, but it's the uncomfortable brightness of a light source when viewed against the darker background, and when we can see this in these two images here. And it's an interesting issue that we've got with traffic signal lights these days. Since they've moved to LEDs, highway authorities have stopped dimming them at night, and therefore they become quite a nuisance. And as you can see here, you know, viewed against the dark background, they are really, really bright, and actually they can be a glare disability source that prevents the driver seeing what is happening past the traffic signals. And on the other side, we've got a media screen where, again, that is so bright it is actually lighting the building opposite, and it is really bright within that field. And again, from a motorist point of view, that is causing a lot of glare, and the same for pedestrians. And depending on what task you're doing, it can be a combination or one of the other types of glare that we've just talked about. Now, what I did say was that we're not just worried about humans, we're worried about fauna and flora. Mainly these days, insects are becoming more of a concern, but most of the concern comes around the presence of bats and other protected species. The Bat Conservation Trust have worked with the Institution of Lighting Professionals and have produced a guidance document that you can see here. It's freely available as a download from the Institution of Lighting Professionals website. And that's being revised again at the moment. But what it looks to get the designers to understand that if there is the presence of bats within an environment, etc., we need to consider the lighting. And bats are normally affected by a blue light content. And from that point of view, this is why LEDs are a bit of a concern, because LEDs do have a high blue light content. So if we have a high color temperature LED, that's quite a cold light source, that's got a very high blue light content. But if we have a nice warm LED, that's got a much lower blue light source, and therefore that is better for lesser effect on fauna and flora. But if we can use amber light sources, then that is even better, and it seemed to have quite minimal effects on them. But different species are affected in different ways, and one size does not fit all in with regard to mitigation. So we try to look at different limitation zones that we can look at from the lighting between where the bats are. We try to understand whether it's the roost aspect or whether it's a flight corridor and all of these sort of things, and then look at what aspects that we can put in place to make sure that the artificial light does not adversely affect the fauna and flora. And I also mentioned sky glow. Now that's the brightening of the night sky. There is an aspect of natural sky glow around, but what we're really talking about is artificial sky glow and caused by the luminaires, and that stops us seeing the wonder and the beauty of the night sky. And what we see is the effect in the bottom picture here. It is a phenomenon. It's not something you can really measure. It is climate dependent. If there's a big cloudy night, you will notice it a lot more than being on a clear night. But the factors we're trying to look at is that what we want to do is we want to limit the light out from the luminaire in the angles that are shown in the diagram on the left-hand side between B, C, and D. And the more we can control the light out from those angles, the more we can reduce the effect of sky glow. So if we can just get a luminaire that emits light, say in the area E, then that will have the minimal effect on creating any sky glow, and it will only necessarily be reflected light off a surface that might cause a problem. It's light emitted at those angles that reflects off particulates in the sky that causes the glow. Light going straight up does not tend to really reflect adversely back down towards ground level. So the light in A, which we don't want to put up anyway, is not necessarily contributing to sky glow. And again, we've got different parameters that we can look to apply that have been issued by the CIE in various tables here, depending on the environmental zone. So it's a matter of what we call the upward light ratio from the installed luminaire. We should say that there are some luminaires that say they are dark skies suitable, but that's only in an installed position. It doesn't stop you installing it wrongly and it's still being a problem. So you can't just go by a label. Now, when we come to planning, the National Online Planning Guidance has got 7 discussion points, and these are here as follows. Essentially, when is light pollution relevant to planning? What factors should be considered? What factors are relevant to where the light shines? And these are the sort of questions that planners are expected to ask and inquire about whenever they're looking to assess an installation. And the first question should always be, does it need to be lit in the first place? And if it does need to be lit, then we can go through a series of aspects to understand what the task is, how to effectively light the task, and as part of that, how do we then manage all the factors of obtrusive light around all of that? Because that's what we want to achieve. We want to achieve a good lighting installation with minimal impact on the environment. So what I'm just going to do now, I'll just try and look at a couple of case studies or things that we can practically do. Now, the city of Helsinki recently has been concerned about light pollution over the city. This is an enhanced map generated from satellites. And what they wanted to do was the development of a citywide artificial lighting plan. So what they've done, they spoke to my colleagues in Finland, and I've supported in that. And really what's been done out there is to look at the causes and the concerns of artificial lighting within Helsinki, and these are just some photos from around the city of car park lighting, road lighting, industrial lighting, and media screens light, especially the media screen where you can see in the top right hand corner where it projects light actually across the footpath, which is quite bad. So to understand what was going on, a survey was undertaken. I think there were just under 2,000 respondents, which was a very good response for doing a survey. And they were really asked as to, can you identify artificial light sources that you feel are good, aren't a problem, and those that you feel are obtrusive light, they are too bright, they're causing you problems, and what are those problems? And these are just some of the maps and the keys that came out of those surveys to get the public opinion. And then going forward, based on what was known, they've done performance measurements on the acceptable lighting, the unacceptable lighting, and therefore that's allowed limitations to be placed, say, on media screens. And these are just diagrams that are being developed and Helsinki City Council are looking at the moment before they move forward to publish, just to give a diagrammatic view of how to look to good lighting, what good lighting practice should be. So down in the bottom, we haven't got light spilling into the sea and the harbour area. We're keeping it all contained on land, etc. We haven't got a media screen, as we see in the top left-hand side, lighting up the plaza, but we've got a screen that you can see the value and what the message is, but it's not becoming a source of light to the environment and so forth. Within the UK, road lighting is often complained about quite a lot. It has now been proven by a lot of astronomers that road lighting is no longer the key source of sky glow and problems. Through the use of LEDs, etc., most of the lighting is going downwards. It's now sports lighting, security lighting, and other lighting that is the problem. But what we now do within highway lighting is that we apply adaptive lighting. Again, the Institution of Lighting Professionals have a guidance document on this. But what it means is that essentially within the standards, we're allowed to provide a level of light depending on what the traffic flow is. So when the motorway is busy, then we will have, for example, the motorway, we can have one level of lighting. But when the traffic flow drops to below a certain level, we're allowed to adapt the lighting. So effectively, we dim it down. We're still providing the right level of light for the traffic flows, but actually we're now saving energy on this. And this can be applied to all roads, all the way down to residential roads, etc. We do tend to use the word adaptive lighting. People feel they understand what we're doing. They feel safe when we're doing that. If we say we're dimming the lighting, they get upset. And it's just politics. It's the words you use as to what we're doing. But this is a great additional saver of energy. It can help during the dimmed periods at night, which can be from as early as 9:30 at night through to say 5:30 in the morning. It allows us to potentially save, say, another 10–15% on the energy of the lighting installation. So that is all of a great benefit, of course. And also what we're seeing is that cities like Westminster City Council are now looking at the application of lighting across the whole of the city responsibly, and they're developing master plans. So what they're saying is we want lighting to be balanced, we want it to be considered, we don't want one theatre outdoing another theatre or facade and everything else. So we're not having a battleground of who's going to be the brightest. We want coordinated lighting that creates interest, it creates the right environment, etc. And they have developed, working with ourselves, they've developed a lighting master plan, and that looks at the whole application of artificial lighting across the city, from the range of tasks through to amenity, through to facades, and also how the infrastructure can then be used for other sources, such as we see in the bottom here, that it can actually also be multi-use for facilitate smart city technologies such as electric vehicles and other aspects within the whole lighting infrastructure. Now, one of the big issues we've got around at the moment is media screens. Now, media screens are there to convey images, messages relating to adverts, media, information, correlated mainly to the surface that the observer is located upon. But these screens have no optical control. They put just as much light upwards as they do downwards. They can tend to be extremely bright and so forth, and it is causing a general high level of concern. I'm now on a CIE. CIE is the International Commission for Illumination, and they do a lot of the research that then supports the development of standards within countries, etc. And we're looking at the impact of media screens and what the limitations should be, etc. These things are growing in size. The bottom left-hand side is adjacent to the M25, that is 80 square meters. But if we look overseas, especially if we go to the Singapore and China areas, you've got media screens down the sides of buildings that are 700 square meters in size, and they are huge. For you, those of you old enough, it looks a bit like Blade Runner, and the amount of light coming out of these is just tremendous. So we're looking to how these screens can be considered, installed so they serve the purpose, but don't become a problem to the environment and observers. So we've got a lot of guidance out there, and we can go and produce the most fantastic designs and everything else. But then they still go wrong. And a lot of the times we find and go out to do investigations, because we're called out there because people are complaining about light nuisance, that it looks fantastic on paper. And then what we go out there, what we find is that the contractors had a conversation with the client and said, well, actually, we can do this a bit cheaper. We can change this and everything. And the luminaires used changed drastically, and they no longer have the same performance and compliance that was actually in the design. And this causes us a great concern, and it can adversely affect the installation. The worst case I've seen is that lighting columns with full cutoff luminaires were advised, and then they were replaced with bollards and also wall-mounted ones, and security floodlights like we see in the middle here, which is a very cheap floodlight with no optical control. But we also find that luminaires are installed incorrectly. The bottom photo here on the left shows double asymmetric luminaires. They're designed so they installed like that, with the glass horizontally. They put a fantastic beam forward at about 61 degrees that will do a fantastic lighting job. But most of the time we go out to installations, we find they've been installed like the photo on the right, because that's how the person installing them thought they should be installed. They don't understand the product that's being put in and how it should be set up optically. And all that needs on a lot of these installations for mitigation is just for someone to go up there, adjust the thing and just put them down at the right angle. But we shouldn't need to be in that situation in the first place, which is why we've got to look at the competency of contractors to understand what's going on. So if we're looking at general mitigation, how do we want to go forward? I want an area lit. How can I make sure it's going to be effective? Well, the first thing we'd say is employ a competent lighting professional. It is a design installation we're talking about. CDM regulations apply, but if you use the right lighting professionals with the right qualifications, they will ensure that it lives up to a mantra we have, which is the right light in the right place at the right time, controlled by the right system. And as I touched on before, this uses 5 principles of responsible lighting. It needs to have a clear purpose. And the first question is, does it need to be lit? So if it does need to be lit, what is the purpose of that lighting? That lighting should then be targeted. So we're only lighting the area so far as we can that needs to be lit. It says low lighting levels, but what we're saying is that it should be lit to the appropriate standards, and no more than the standard requires for the activity that's being undertaken, whether it's road lighting, whether it's car park lighting, whether it's sports lighting, or whatever. We do not need to put more light there than is absolutely necessary. And then we want to make sure that that lighting is controlled. So it only needs to be on when it is actually needed to be on. And a key thing as part of that is making sure that the control system is commissioned, and that the people who use the site understand how to use it as well. And then the final thing we also need to consider is the color. So it's the light source that is appropriate for the task, but also appropriate for the environment. So if we've got fauna and flora around, we are making sure that, say, the light source that we use is not a high color temperature, because that will adversely affect the bats, and it's more suitable for that aspect. Now, there's a whole host of professional industry guidance. As I said before, the International Commission on the Illumination, the CIE. The 2 main documents are CIE 150, which looks at the limitation of the effects on the protrusive light from outdoor installations, and CIE 126 is the guidelines for minimizing sky glow. Now, these are quite intense documents. There's a lot of detail in there. There's a lot of very, very useful information in there. So working with the CIE, the Institution of Lighting Professionals, myself involved, we have developed GN01, which is now GNO 121. It's just been updated, and that's guidance notes for the reduction of obtrusive light. And really, that is a distillation of what is in CIE 150 and 126. And this is the main document that planners and everybody else refers to. And it's a good grounding document for the professional to refer to and to look at. And then there were various other guidance documents around to do with domestic exterior lighting. That is one of the biggest cases of light nuisance we get, because unfortunately the likes of B&Q, other retailers are available, but the products they sell are really not suitable for putting on the outside of a building and controlling obtrusive light. They have really no optical control at all. So this document gives advice on exterior domestic lighting, security lighting, porch lighting. And then there's the other documents we can see there, like the BATS one I mentioned earlier, brightness of illuminated advertisements, and the guidance for undertaking environmental lighting impact assessments. So just in closing now, key takeaways that I really want to try and get across here is that planning and environmental teams, officers need to involve a competent lighting professional in making the judgment, understanding what's being presented, what to ask for, etc. Need to agree the performance requirements of the installation, but we also need to agree the environmental zone within what it sits, because that will dictate the limitations. Use competent designers, make sure the calculations are correct. We also need to understand the assumptions and mitigation measures that are being put into place and what have been considered and how they're going to be applied. But one of the key things we're now seeing with planning applications, etc., is that the lighting designer needs to be involved throughout the whole thing and needs to be involved at the end to sign off that the installation has been installed as per the agreed design, or where substitution or anything else has happened for whatever reason, that it's been considered and it still fits the criteria of the design. And then we can create the most fantastic, great environments to really attract people like we see from this urban area, public realm area, into it and everything. By the way, that column is meant to be leaning. It's an artistic thing, without causing obtrusive light and problems to that. And this really helps us look at achieving some of the 17 key goals that have been set internationally for us to transform our world, etc. So that's it. Thank you very much for your time. As I say, good lighting practice is the provision of the right light at the right time in the right place, controlled by the right system. And I'll be happy to take your questions. I will send through a PDF of the document, and that will have my contact details if anybody wants to ask anything further. And if I can't answer all the questions after this, then I will be happy to go through and answer them offline and then pass them back through to Andrew so they can be distributed. So thank you for listening.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed, Alan, for the presentation. I was listening and learning a lot throughout the presentation. I will move on to questions just in one moment. Just towards the end, I was quite interested about you saying of substitution of your designs. About 6 years ago, we had somebody come to talk to us about a very similar topic on use of lighting. It was particularly, the speaker was particularly looking at how different coloured light affect mood and such like. You know, it's the old thing about, you know, screens ought to be more yellow at night. But she had actually done a very similar job to you. And I remember something cropped up where she said one of the big bugbears that she had was it was just to the point where a lot of sodium and mercury vapor lamps and high pressure sodium lamps were being moved across to LED. And she said because all that was happening in effect was people taking out one type of bulb and just shoving in an LED one, that the distribution pattern on road surfaces was quite different. And she was very aware, because she'd been involved in designing these things, that suddenly instead of having a nice even illumination across the road, you've got these patches of LED light because of the way the LED was much more tightly defined because of the nature of the lens systems and so on. And she said she was just very aware of that, you know, just that sort of almost without thinking substitution. Oh, well, you can take out sodium lamps and just put in a new head which uses LEDs without thinking any further.
Yeah.
So the obvious thing is employ a professional to do your lighting and make sure that you have people who actually understand how the luminaire should be put up. I've seen similar things. I used to do a lot of work in the amateur theatre, and you get floodlights which are designed with a particular sort of parabolic reflector, and a number of times I've seen those put up upside down. So of course the pattern is wrong. You know, or they're put instead of at the top, are put at the bottom, but still hung as if it was top of the lighting grid, and so all the lights going in the wrong place. So it's quite amazing where it goes wrong. Anyway, right now I'm going to go through. I'm not going to promise to do this exactly in order. I'm just going to pick up on something, and the aim is, by the way, we'll finish in about half an hour's time. Okay, so I think just give everybody a goal. A question asked from Nick, but there's other people have asked the same, asking the same question. Does Scotland have its own different standards with regard to permissible lighting?
Each of the different countries, I always get this wrong, whether it's UK or Great Britain. But anyway, England, Wales, Ireland, Northern Ireland and Scotland have their own different limiting values when it comes to advertising signage. If we're talking about obtrusive light in terms of vertical illuminance onto windows, light spill, source intensity and stuff, then no, we're all operating off the ILP guidance, which is the CIE 150 and 126 document. But certainly from a planning point of view, yes, they do have different criteria when it comes to things like illuminated advertisements between the different countries.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that answer. This one from Philip Brown, which again is a popular question. Solar cell lighting in back gardens is becoming popular. How much will wildlife be affected by the increase in solar cell lighting?
I'm not quite sure that the little decorative lights that we see around in people's gardens will necessarily have too much of an effect. But then looking at my own bedroom window, the lady across the road now seems to have an airport in her front garden with the way she's marked out the footpath and everything else that I can see from upstairs. And therefore that's going to have an effect of attracting moths and insects down to those levels, which obviously then adversely affects them. And then that can just move further down the food chain by the fact that the insects are not where, say, bats, etc., would expect to find them. So it can have that effect. And what we are seeing is that a lot of these items are more on the cold white end of the spectrum, high color temperature, and therefore they've got a higher blue light content. The other aspect I tend to find with a lot of these, and it's a small hobby horse of mine and a little distraction on this, but they don't have the proper CE marking or the UKCA mark. They have what's called the Chinese export mark, where the C is right next to the E, and actually they should not be on the market. And most of them seem to be stocked in garden centres. I'm forever being sad and pointing it out that actually they should not be selling these products because they're just non-compliant in the first place. But yeah, we are seeing a move to people putting lighting schemes into their garden without that much consideration, but it's not necessarily something that falls under planning. And it's the same with domestic security lighting. You're allowed to go and do it. And we have the big issue. One of the biggest things we're trying to deal with now is there's a lot of concern about light spill from buildings. We call it the Kevin McLeod effect because he tries to encourage everybody to have a whole glass wall to invite the outside in, but at night it's the other way around. And we're being asked to model that, but there's nothing you can do to advise, to tell a resident or anybody how you should light your own house and what you can put inside your house, and therefore control what light goes out of the house into the environment if you've got big windows, etc. So there's all sorts of things around there that are, people want to start to looking at how they can manage, but it's very difficult to look at how to do it.
Okay, thank you. Well, I'll just say from my personal experience, I have some lights which are triggered, which are designed to, well, there's sort of solar cell lights, but they are triggered by IR in my front garden. And we have both badgers and foxes coming into our front garden, and they don't seem to be affected at all. These are using white LED lights. I mean, they're just commercial products from Amazon, but it doesn't seem to. The badgers and foxes don't seem to care. You know, the light comes on and then it goes off because it's on a timer. They just happily sort of wander around. So for those sort of animals, it doesn't seem to affect them. What it does for moths and creatures like that, I don't know. But
no, I think badgers and foxes have become, in certain cases, have become quite urbanized, and therefore, you know, they're more worried if there's people around than
yes, I would agree with that. Yeah. But I haven't seen sort of moths sort of gathering around them either. So, and bats, I don't think are affected because they're working on sonar type systems. So I've never seen a bat sort of get distracted. But I'm sure we could find an example. A question from Jim. You mentioned the problem that traffic crossing lights are no longer dimmed at certain times of the. Is it dimmed at night? I just missed that. Was it dimmed at night?
Yeah. What we normally have is that during the daytime you've got a very high background ambient lighting level, or you have a distinct level of brightness to use a term for the traffic signals, so you can actually see them against the daylight conditions. And what used to happen is that at night time they used to dim down because they used to have a tungsten halogen bulb in them, and therefore, you know, you dimmed it down, it saved a bit of energy. But the regulations don't need you to do that anymore, which is why they appear so bright. And because LEDs are more directional as well, it just adversely affects it. And we've got the same concern with emergency service vehicle blue lights. That you can see them during the daytime, but at night time, if you're behind them, they are just
intense, aren't they?
It's disability glare from them.
Yeah, very intense. Yes.
Yeah.
Sorry, I just missed the nuance when you said about that. Anyway, Jim says, well, if they're no longer required to be dimmed, why aren't they required to be dimmed now? Now that they've gone to LEDs.
Well, the thing is, the rules change, but you get to the stage and the argument goes, LEDs are very energy efficient. The amount of extra energy you save by dimming it is so insignificant compared to the cost of the control system. But is it worth doing? And this is where we go back to the argument, and hopefully National Highways, which was Highways England a few weeks ago, we're working with them to actually look at changing that so that they should be, because the aim is, what is the task of it to do, and let's make sure it achieves the task. And if that needs something in there to say that it's become done, it's not difficult to do, it's just a little photo cell, and then they should dim down.
Okay, all right, because you don't need to answer this bit, but Jim just makes the point that, and indeed you have, that you know, surely it's nothing to do with energy saving, it's the fact that, you know, they're over bright at night time. Just going back to our animal question, Malcolm has put something in the chat line. This is a question, and you don't have to answer it. Sorry, Malcolm, but I'm just going to read that. What he says is, perhaps it's the bat's sleep cycle that is disturbed by light rather than navigation. And I know I said I didn't think it would affect their navigation, which I'm sure it doesn't.
It depends where you're looking at. It certainly does affect roosts. If there's a roost in the area, then it will affect when the bats start to come out. If the roost has lighting on it, then it will affect when they start coming out. If we're talking about the flight corridor, there's been an awful lot of surveys done through radar technology and everything. And what we found is if we've got amber colored lights, the route doesn't change. But if we move to a high color temperature white light source, the route of the bats is pushed away from the light source. And it can also act as a blocker. So if we light a road and there's a bat flight path across it, so what we would tend to do is try to work out how we can leave a gap, reduce the road lighting level, but not to adversely affect safety, but so that we try to keep that route as clear as possible.
Okay, thank you. That's very interesting, because I just hadn't appreciated that the bats were so far. I could see the point about roosts, you know, affecting when they come out, but I hadn't thought about the fact that they might like dark corridors. Okay. Hiran Patel asked the question: are in-ground uplighters or similar lighting for trees and buildings, and he emphasizes here pointing upwards, a concern for a significant contribution to sky glow. And there was somebody else asked a question about sky glow, which you wouldn't mind. Oh, yes. You said in your presentation that lights pointing straight up don't contribute much to sky glow. Could you explain that again? So if you could answer two questions, why don't these architectural ground lighters and uplighters and also just lights pointing straight up affect sky glow, please?
Now Hiran promised me in WhatsApp that he wasn't going to.
Oh, I see. You know. Okay, right. Anyway.
No, it's fine.
Carry on.
The thing is, what we've got is that sky glow is a phenomenon, and it's generally created by light that reflects off particulates and aerosols in the atmosphere. So whether that's water, vapor, dust, and all the rest of it. So if we've got light that comes out in the angles I said of the luminaire, say between sort of horizontal up to 110 degrees from 0 being straight down, that light's coming out at an angle, and when that hits it, then it's reflected or reflected back down towards the ground. If we've got light that's going straight up, say from an uplighter that Hiran mentions and so forth, that light doesn't tend to get reflected as much back down as light that comes out at an angle from the luminaire and then comes down to us. So that's really the main thing why we're more concerned about the angles that come out. Now, what we're trying to do with uplighters, they're a nuisance anyway from a maintenance perspective, etc. But the main problem with uplighters is people use them for trees. And what we find, especially if you say you're in London, and if you look at, I think it's a London plane tree, if you look at a London plane tree that's got some light on it, in the winter it will still have its leaves, but the part of the tree that hasn't got the light on it will have shed its leaves. So actually light onto trees has an adverse effect on how the tree goes through its cycle, and of course anything that nests or wants to live within the tree. So we have to be very, very careful when we're looking at uplighters as to what we're doing. We can use them to wash a facade of a building, and we can look carefully perhaps at trees, but this is where we really need to make sure that at a certain time we need to turn off or really question as to what is the right way of doing these things.
Okay, thanks very much indeed, Alan. A question on behalf of Christopher Brew. Why is light rated as temperature rather than frequency?
I can't 100%. I suppose I've never really asked the question. Really, it's
I mean, it just is, isn't it? You talk about lighting, it's color temperature of lighting.
Yeah, it's just the way that we describe the effect of white light sources, because white light sources are made up of a whole range of different frequencies of light. And color temperature is just the term that we use. So 6,000 Kelvin is a very, very cold white light source. There's a massive blue light content within that, whereas we're now moving on road lighting, etc., to about 2,700, and that's quite a warm light source. It's more slightly getting towards a slightly orangey quite color and much warmer. What we find is if we use the cold white light source, people tend to move through a space quite quickly. So if we don't want them to congregate, we want to get them through, but that adversely affects fauna and flora. If we use a warm light source, then we're more likely to stay, more likely to congregate, and it creates a nicer environment in that. I can't say I've ever really contemplated. I may have a look at that when I'm in at some other point and come up with a better answer.
Yeah, well, Andrew Armstrong just posted that, of course, color temperature relates to black body radiation, and that's what I have. You know, you heat up a black body, and it's the temperature has to get to or something similar. Yeah. But I know certainly in filming, they always are measuring color temperature. They rate film against color temperature rather than frequency. It may be just it's a more convenient way of defining things, and particularly if it's lined up with what's happening in a physics lab.
Yeah.
Yes. Also, it's easier to measure the frequency in one way. You know, it's easier to measure the temperature of something than measure the frequency in this application. That's my guess, anyway. Right. Now, here's an interesting one. David Haddon Rees he lives in the North York Moors National Park, I assume from what he says. A local pub recently installed some very strong lights which shine for miles. David asked the planning officer whether the national park could control this and got the answer no. However, the planning officer suggested the light wasn't just for task purposes, but also probably for advertising. Can you challenge bright lights on the basis that it's being used for advertising rather than task, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, all the planning authorities, the national planning stuff, there's very tight permitted lighting levels if it's illuminated advertisement signing. And if they're considering it's for that, then that's the case. If it is within the national park, then the National Park Authority should get involved and actually manage it down. And this is where I'd sort of say a starting point perhaps would be the ILP's guide for domestic security lighting, because that talks about the right sort of products to use, how to set them up and everything else. Because, I mean, yeah, what are they trying to do? Attract a lost hiker from miles away to say, you know, there's the beacon in the distance, and it's just not applicable. There's quite a range of aspects that can be drawn on. The problem is that official light nuisance has to be artificial light emitted from a premise that affects someone's enjoyment of their own premise. So that's where it gets difficult if you're just there's light spilling into just general areas, if you know what I mean, because it's not defined as a premise. But certainly there's aspects around that can be done. I do find that environmental officers do tend not to want to get involved.
Well, I can see why it's sort of like a dispute between neighbours, isn't it, over the height of the hedge or something, you know?
Well, yeah, I mean, but I suppose part of the problem is that a lot of local authorities no longer have their own lighting professional, the lighting design manager for the roads and everything else that could advise them. But really, we're saying that, well, if you haven't got that, then you need to go and see about getting someone involved. And quite often I find that the resident hasn't had the response they want from the environmental department, and therefore they then commission us to go along to have a look, and we find that there is a case. But of course, then from that point of view, that does cost a resident because they're calling in a consultant, which is not right, really. It's, you know, it's not the sort of business I necessarily want to be in, because I understand they've got a real problem, and it's just a shame that it's not dealt with by the right people because they don't know. But the courses are run, and the ILP do have some courses to try to advise on the stuff, so that at least there is a general understanding that it can be an issue and why it's an issue and what should be considered.
Yeah, okay. Thank you for that answer. Hopefully David will be able to pursue it in Andrew's own steam. Right, okay, now here's an interesting suggestion. I'm not sure whether you want to, I'll just put it, it's you don't have to answer this, but Ian makes the point that his ladders have a label with a diagonal line to show the safe angle of use, and he's suggesting, why don't spotlights manufacturers be encouraged to do something similar, you know, a line which says this is the preferred angle of for the luminaire. I
think in a lot of cases they do.
It's
on the box and stuff, but that part might never actually get to the person that's installing.
Well, I think that's perhaps the point that Ian's making. You know, ladders actually have it sort of stuck absolutely on the side of it.
So I think it's an interesting thing to move forward to, and yeah, no, I think it's that's a good little idea, that as to what it does. Yeah, no, I like that. But on the other hand, I have seen plenty of luminaires that say this side towards the road, and it hasn't stopped it being put up 180 degrees around the wrong way.
Yeah.
Because it's the bayonet cap goes at the back, doesn't it? Well, they didn't in the old days, so yes. So, but no, it's an interesting point. I'll raise that in the industry like that. Yeah.
Okay, well, they are. It is an interesting suggestion. You know, you put it actually on the luminaire, you might have more chance. Even if the installer, the immediate installer gets wrong, somebody else may come along later and go, well, why is that line, which should be, let's say, vertical, you know, why is it now horizontal?
Yeah.
You know, particularly if things slip, we know luminaires in forks, given time will slip, and anyway, it's a nice thought from
No.
Ian,
It's,
isn't it?
Yeah, that's worth some consideration. I like that. Yeah, yes.
Well, it'll be called the Howard line, won't it?
Well, no, just.
Sorry, I was just teasing you. And also playing with the TV program Howard's line. Anyway, right. A question from says Spedding Consultancy. So I don't know whether it's Mr. Spedding on his own or a group called Spedding Consultancy. Alan, over the many decades, it seems to have become custom and practice to light roads, especially motorways, to a far greater extent than years ago. I'm curious as to whether this meets the objective. I'm not quite sure which objective, it doesn't say here. Do you have any reliable statistics on the effectiveness of lighting, reducing fatalities and fatalities and accidents? Fatalities and accidents on the road.
Yeah, we have no legal obligation to light roads. There's no duty to light roads. Where roads are lit, there is a duty to light them properly and make sure it is maintained to function as it should do. In fact, it's interesting, there's a lot of highways, national highways, have actually reduced the amount of motorway that's been lit. But what we have is there is a document from National Highways, as I say, was Highways England, still is on the website, called TA 501. If you Google it, you can download it, and that requires us to do a cost-benefit analysis of the application of lighting against the number of accidents, whether it's fatalities, severe accidents, and so forth. And that comes up with a cost-benefit ratio as to the cost of putting the lighting in against the accidents saved, because different levels of accidents from fatalities to serious have different values assigned against them. And therefore, if the score comes out at a certain level, we will put lighting in. If it doesn't, then we won't necessarily, unless there's a view that there are other contributing factors that will consider that. Now, the current research indicates that artificial lighting for a motorway will save somewhere around about 11% of nighttime accidents. When we move into the more urban realm, local authority lighting, then the current figure, although the research could do with reinvestigation and so forth, etc., that's more around 30%, because a lot of the incidences are more to do with the interaction of pedestrians and vehicles, or iPhone zombies, as we start to call them, because people are taking less, don't tend to take as much care as they might have in the past about suddenly walking into the road. So that's why it's artificial light is more around 30% for the local authority type roads. It's around about 11% for motorways as it stands at the moment from the latest figures.
Well, on a personal level, when certainly on motorways, I much prefer them when they are lit, and particularly when you suddenly go from a lit one, even if it's graduated down, you suddenly find you're on a dark bit of road, and I much prefer.
I couldn't disagree, and also from a driver fatigue point of view, there's a lot of research that says that you're more fatigued driving on a dark road, you're less fatigued driving on a lit road, and you're further less fatigued if you're driving on a lit road with the sun visor down, because you're not affected by any glare from the luminaire. But driver fatigue and stuff, it's everything's driven by cost-benefit analysis, I'm afraid.
Yeah, and of course there was a big drive, wasn't there? It was kinder to the environment to turn off lighting. You know, I remember councils make a big play of, you know, it's our contribution to. Yeah. But of course, with LED lights, I mean, they obviously still burn energy, but you know, it seems a different equation. I haven't, and certain areas, I mean, it's quite awful, particularly in not necessarily motorways, but just normal roads. You know, you suddenly go from an urban where they used to be lit, and suddenly bang, you're out in effectively the sort of dark countryside, particularly on roads which are high speed and twisty. I personally don't like it. But yeah, it's a difficult one. Now, here's an interesting one for Jim. Now, Jim actually got a little answer from I'll read out the question to you. Jim got a little answer here, but from somebody who put it in the chat line, and it only went to you and me rather than everybody. Anyway, Jim said, is there anything you think can be done, possibly publicity, regulation or guidance, he says, about the low level but rapidly growing levels of light pollution. For example, here in North Wilts, our village used to be delightful for stargazing, bats, hedgehogs, moths, etc. In recent years, it's become very fashionable to have permanent security lights rather than motion-activated lights. He then goes on to say Malmesbury Abbey has put up a lit-up cross, which might be nice if you'd like that sort of thing, but casts light pollution for a very long way from the top of a tower on top of a hill. I won't go on the other, but so really what Jim's saying is, what do you think could be done to encourage people to think about this? Don't just bung up, in this case, Malmesbury Abbey, a big cross, lit up and permanent security lights. And actually, the comment that Stuart Fisher, as I said, he only sent this back to you and me rather than everyone. It says, Jim, I can't quite see Malmesbury Abbey from here in Corston. I suspect it should be sort of ... But if I was only a mile or so nearer, I would. Anyway, what do you think could be done to sort of help raise awareness amongst general public about things like permanently on security lights and people
think,
just...
Yes, as I touched on before, the institutional lighting professionals have produced the document of the domestic security lighting and everything else. But what we're trying to do, and we're working with the UK Lighting Liaison Group, which represents all of the professional bodies, etc., that are interested in artificial light, etc., to look to how we can have discussions with the retailers to make sure that they stock the right sort of products. Most of them at the moment do not stock products that are suitable with any optical control whatsoever. And of course, people tend to want to go and buy a cheap thing, and then they're not set up properly. So that guidance document helps that, but we're trying to lobby and get the retailers to really start to take this seriously in what they stock. And perhaps like Wix do, Wix has a whole area of information guides on how to. I mean, I've picked up one which is how to plaster a wall because I need to go and do some, and I wanted to see whether I could do it myself. But just to cover those aspects. Now, to raise greater awareness, about 6 months ago, there was set up an all-party parliamentary dark skies group, which was aimed, and basically that's anybody in Parliament that has an interest in a topic sets up an all-party parliamentary group, and this is a dark skies one. And they have already started to raise an awareness within government circles, etc., about the impact of artificial light, especially on dark skies, and to promote dark skies. And they've started to publicise some guidance documents and everything. So there's a little bit of a ball rolling. The Dark Skies Association have always been very, very good on this. The Campaign for Protection of Rural England have used to do some good work, but therefore they tend to still focus on street lighting as being the big issue. And the astronomy world have done a lot of really detailed research, and they're not finding street lighting is the issue these days because of LED lights, etc., and how they're set up. It is security lighting, it is sports lighting, and those installations that now need to be targeted. So this is what we're looking at. And again, it comes back to education for the planning and environmental departments in local authorities to actually look at what's there. I can appreciate there was possibly a need for some sort of illuminated cross, but you need to look at how bright that needs to be. Can it actually be designed? And you can design it like media screens so that actually you will only see it if you're within a certain proximity of it, because it will have optical control. And therefore, if you're a long way off, you won't see it. But if you're very close to the church, cathedral, or whatever it is, then you will see it because of the way that the optics are designed for you to do that. But these sort of areas, there's stuff out there, but again, it comes back, I think, to education for planners and environmental officers in understanding those bits and pieces, what can be done, and just talking to people to get advice. Quite often the likes of myself are quite happy just to have a conversation with someone for 5-10 minutes. That doesn't come with a bill. So, because we just like to see good effect. Or if they've got a query, right through to the Institution of Lighting and Professionals, the Society of Light and Lighting, they have technical teams who will then respond to you and give you guidance on where to go and look or how to mitigate those issues, etc.
Okay, thank you very much, Alan. Well, I'm going to draw to a close now, but just before I do, Stuart, this is just a comment to Stuart Fisher, who asked a question about what you can do to help try to minimise, let's call it nighttime glare from other traffic users and things. You mentioned ambulances, he's mentioning police cars with very bright red light. Stuart, Haran Patel has put a suggestion in the chat line, suggesting that you talk to your optician. They can, or used to be able to provide spectacles with a yellow tint, which apparently work well. So you might, so Stuart, you might want to just read Hiram's post in the chat line. And just to follow up on the Malmesbury Abbey, just sort of slightly amused me. David Haddon Rees. Now, he was the gentleman who was asking the question about the North York Moors and the pub, which is, now he's put, I'll just read it out. Again, I'm just doing this because we'll close. But anyway, David Haddon Rees, brackets, I'm assuming REVD, it stands for Reverend. Okay. He's put that REVD in brackets. I am lighting advisor to the York Diocese. And for us, at least, the issue of light spill and nuisance and floodlighting and exterior advertising the presence of the church is very carefully looked at the diocesan planning stage, including site experiments before final planning. So he's just made that comment that certainly the York Diocese take it, look into it very carefully. So perhaps David ought to give some advice to Malmesbury Abbey on this. We've got this glaring cross.
No, that's good, and a lot of bodies do, and they are very good at it in light trials. I think one of the worst bodies I tend to find, and it's surprising, is the National Trust. They've got a car park near Waterston Manor in Bucks, which is in the middle of nowhere, and it is the most light polluting car park installation I've ever come across.
Okay, right. Okay, well, look, Alan, we'll close now. Thank you very much indeed for giving your presentation and for answering the questions and answers. We've gone through most of the questions. We haven't done more, but they will be, all the questions will be pulled off and be sent off to you with a request. If you could just put a little succinct answer and anything we didn't answer, if you could fill it out. Just a reminder that there is a CPD certificate available for tonight. It's worth 2 points. It is already posted on the blog and file pages of the IET Buckinghamshire website. As I said earlier on, just go and Google IET Buckinghamshire, and that will get you to the right page very, very quickly. So the certificate is there. All you have to do is you just type your own name in, save it to your own device, type your own name in, and that's your copy. If anybody hits a problem downloading it, just drop me a line. My email address is actually on event pages. I don't hide. It is andrew.dodd@ietvolunteer.org. Don't worry if you didn't get that. As I said, it is on the web page. It's also in any event Bucks runs. I always put how to get hold of myself. And anything that anybody wants followed up. And the recording will be posted in the next couple of weeks or so. So with that, Alan, I'll formally thank you and stop the recording. Thank you everybody who asked questions, both in Q&A and made points in the chat line. So good night.
Thank you.